Welcome to the podcast hosted by timecamp.com on how to stay on top of your work.
Welcome back. This is Kate with another episode of the podcast Stay on Top of Your Work. And today my guest is Kevin Eikenberry. And Kevin is a world-renowned leadership expert, a two-time best-selling author, speaker, consultant, trainer, coach, and leader. Kevin is the Chief Potential Officer of the Kevin Eikenberry Group, a leadership and learning consulting company that has been helping organizations, teams, and individuals reach their potential since 1993. He has been named to 5 exclusive lists in 2014 to E&C.com's top 100 leadership and management experts in the world and 100 great leadership speakers for your next conference, American Management Association's Leader to Watch in 2015, and Top Sales World to 2015 Top Sales and Marketing Influencers, as well as the Best 50 Leadership Blog Sites from Ready to Manage in 2016. He has worked with Fortune 500 companies, small firms, universities, government agencies, hospitals, and many more. Kevin is also the creator and content developer of the Remarkable Leadership Learning System. Hi, Kevin. I'm happy to have you here today.
Kate, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Fine. So for the beginning, can you tell a few more words about you and your professional interests?
Oh my gosh, you already said more than the world wants to know.
Really?
So I guess the thing that I would say is that of all that stuff that you kindly shared that talk about what I do out in the world, for everyone listening today, probably the most important thing to know is that I'm leading a team every day. I'm leading a team that is largely remote from me every day. So like many of you, that's the world that I live in. So yes, I spend a lot of my time coaching, consulting, training leaders, writing about leadership, leading my own blog and podcast. The reality is that just like all of you, I'm doing this work every day of leading a team and leading a team remotely, which is a challenge.
Okay. So when we talk about being a leader, from your own experience and working with other people, what does it mean to be a good leader? What are the bad and good qualities that you have noticed people have and how to deal with that?
Well, that's a big question, Kate. I'll say a couple of things to get us started, and then you can take us from there however you want. The first thing I would say is that to be a great leader, we must be a learner. And so at some level, if you're listening here, you're already that at some level, which is great. But in order for us to be a successful leader, listen, the work of being a leader is complex and challenging. And so in order to get good at it, we got to keep working at it, number one. And secondly, I've never met a leader, Kate, that didn't want their team members to be growing and learning. And the best way for us to influence them to do that is to be an example of it ourselves. So the first thing I would say is to be a great leader, we must be a learner. And the second thing I would say is that leadership really, even though I started out here, that we must be a learner, leadership at the end of the day isn't about us at all. It's really about the outcomes that we're trying to reach and the people that we're using to help reach them. So I often talk about, in my new book that's coming in a few months, The Long Distance Leader, we talk about the 3O model of leadership: ourselves, outcomes, and others.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk a little bit about your previous book, The Remarkable Leadership. What strategies or maybe methods can you describe and maybe provide some, more information on how to use them and apply them in the leadership?
Sure. So that book is called Remarkable Leadership, as you said. And in that book, we really are talking about what we can consider to be 13 competencies that make highly effective leaders. And the goal of the book is to help leaders grow in their role every day and one skill at a time. So I already talked about learning being one of those 13 competencies. There's 12 others. And the goal of the book and the goal for the reader is to give them very specific takeaways that they can go work on. Now, because there's 13 competencies, I can't stand here or actually sit here as I talk to you, Kate, and say, hey, here's what you ought to go do. But rather what we do throughout the book is give you short little assessments to help you say, where should I focus? Because leadership is big and where all of us are is at a different place. So we should be focused on what will help make us get the most progress at a given time. And that means that we need to be selective on what we need to be learning and what we want to be growing on. And so the goal of the book is to provide those connections to all those skill areas to say, if this is where my gap is, here's what I ought to work on next. And in every case, we're trying to give people very practical sorts of things that they can go work on. So even if you don't read the book, I think the takeaway from your question, Kate, is identify what you ought to be working on, where you think you can add the most value right now if you get better as a leader, and then go out and specifically work on that thing, whether that's getting coaching, whether that's doing some reading, listening to a podcast, whether that's whatever that might be, to help you get better at that particular area next, because we can't focus on everything at once.
Mm-hmm. So also when we talk about leadership, I'm thinking about team management. How to manage a team in order for it to be good and kind of, friendly and have that nice atmosphere.
Okay. Well, a couple things there. So first of all, that's where a lot of people want to think about a team is, how do I get everybody to like each other? And of course, that would be preferable. And of course, we need people to have good, solid working relationships. And that's part of how we make a more effective team come together. But I believe there's more to it than that. And as a leader, we have a responsibility in those areas. And one of those is to help build a level of commitment amongst the team members, which is different than people sort of getting along and having a nice working relationship. It's about, are people committed to each other, to the success of the team? And so as a leader, we need to be working on helping to create that. And we need to be figuring out how to build alignment amongst the goals for the team members, the team, and how they relate to our organizational goals. So if you're leading a project team, people need to know the goal of the project. They need to know what their goals are within the project, but they also need to know how this project is going to impact the larger organization or the client organization or whatever. And if we can't create that clear line of sight, we can't have as successful of a team as we want. So Kate, to your specific question, one of the things that we need to be doing as a leader is not just providing people with training or a team building exercise, but giving people a clear picture of what success looks like, where we're headed, and how we can get there. If we can do those things and we can set people up to be successful and help provide meaning for them, so that because they know now what they're doing makes a difference, those two things will make a big difference.
Okay, so how do you think it applies in remote team management? Because TimeCamp is a startup company, and at TimeCamp we have a lot of remote workers. So I guess managing a team which is, situated in different parts of the world or of the country, it's not always easy. So how to do it in order for it to be successful? So
Kate, you ask good questions, but you ask big questions. So let me say a couple things about the remote piece. Like if you are, as a listener, if you're on a remote team or if you're leading a remote team, here's the thing. Chances are you're pretty productive. All of the research shows that people who work remotely are pretty darn productive. But the challenge that they often have is they become pretty insular. They become very good at their tasks, but they don't really see the bigger picture. So one of the challenges for us as a remote leader, one of many, is to create the communication links and create a sense of inclusion in the team so people feel like they're on a team and not just doing their own work, right? So while in big organizations, we often talk about people working in silos and this department and that department and the next department, the challenge that we have remotely is all of that, plus it becomes much more personal. People are really good at getting their tasks done, but they're not always as good at the collaboration that's needed and that we as leaders might want from them. So if you're leading a remote team, you likely need to spend more time in connecting with your remote team members and connecting them together, encouraging them to communicate in ways other than through instant message, the project management tool, and email.
All right. And what do you think about the use of special tools for team management when it comes to remote team management? Do you think it's important?
Well, I think that one of the I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. One of the ways we're able to do it successfully is through technology. Technology can really mediate and help us be successful. And so, you and I are using a remote technology right now to have this conversation. We are not, unfortunately, in the same room. And so, and while no one else can see us, we can see each other. And so just having a webcam, for example, can make a big difference. I can hopefully not interrupt you, although I did just a minute ago, and vice versa. And so, the ability to create something that's closer to a face-to-face interaction is valuable. We've got a lot of tools in there, and there are a lot of tools in the same space. I'm not here to say you ought to use this tool or that tool. What I am suggesting is two things. Use the right tools for the right tasks. I already mentioned that a second ago. We rely too much on email and instant messenger and those sorts of things when we need to be picking up the phone or getting on a technology so we can see each other, using technologies to share documents in real time and those sorts of things. So use the tools you've got and use them effectively, not only in terms of when to use them, but also use all the available technology. So the point of this, that most people use about 20% of the available capacity of a given piece of technology, software technology, especially in the remote world, right? We know how to connect. We know how to hear each other's voices. We don't know how to share a screen or do a poll or do any number of other things that we might want to do that would actually make our meetings more effective, our interactions more effective. So use the tools for the right purposes and learn how to use the tools better would be two things I would say for sure will make a difference.
That's a good advice. So let's go back to team management, because when you manage a team as a leader, there are often conflicts. So how to solve conflicts, or maybe how to avoid them?
Well, there are going to be conflicts, and the first thing I would say is this: a conflict isn't necessarily bad. If we never have conflict, that either means that some people aren't sharing what they really think, or we're all thinking exactly the same thing, which means we're not going to really grow. So I don't encourage you to think about how do I eliminate all conflict, but rather how do we productively resolve it when it occurs, right? And the shortest answer I can give you there is the sooner you can resolve it, the better. The longer that a conflict grows, the more tentacles it gets, the harder it gets to solve, the more locked into a mental place the participants are. So as a leader, we want to be watching for conflict, and we want to be helping to mediate it as soon as we can. One of the other things that I would say, then I want to make a comment about conflict and remote, but the other thing I would say is this, and that is that while I do suggest that we nip conflict in the bud, I am not suggesting that we as leaders need to immediately and automatically get involved ourselves. The first thing that we ought to do as a leader when we identify that there's a conflict, or when someone comes to us with a conflict situation, is to say, have the two of you tried to work it out? So while I think we want to solve conflict, I don't think we should immediately get involved every time, or we'll be involved in some that we don't need to be involved in. In a remote setting, sometimes it's harder to determine the conflicts exist because people aren't walking up and down the hall and that sort of thing. So I think we have to be more aware. I think we also can recognize that sometimes if people are really sort of staying in their own lane and in their own bubble, there may not be as much conflict. But when it starts to occur, it may grow more before we identify it. So we just, as a leader, have to be more aware and ready to address it and help to mediate it and resolve it as soon as we can.
All right. That's a good piece of advice. So when it comes to conflicts, this is one of the challenges that leaders meet. What are other challenges that leaders meet, and how can they be solved or avoided, or maybe any other way that can be good for a leader in that?
Well, it's a long list, right? Because we're leading people and everybody's different, so we got the list that any one individual listener could have might be different from anybody else's. But certainly there are a ton of things as it relates. If leadership is about outcomes and other people, then you could identify a ton of possible challenges in either of those ways. Like, does everyone understand what the outcomes are? Does everyone know what the goals are? Does everyone have a clear plan for reaching their goals? How are you coaching them to reach those goals? All those sorts of things, which starts to bleed over into others. We've already talked about a little bit about teams and a little bit about conflict, but there's whole bunches of challenges for us around how do we lead and influence change? How do we communicate more effectively? How do we coach more effectively? The list kind of goes on and on. And I think, again, for many of listeners here, many of whom are probably either on or leading project teams or have a bunch of projects within their work, right? Even if they're not a, quote, project manager, I think that obviously there are a ton of challenges there. All of the kinds of things I just mentioned and other things too, like how do we manage scope creep and those sorts of things. So there's the list is endless, if you will, about all of the challenges that we could face. The good news is that as we start to recognize some principles, like we talk about in the book Remarkable Leadership, we can start to give ourselves better odds in many of those situations quickly.
Okay. So I'd like to ask you, when you're a leader, how to make an impact and stand out and be more influential in the world of leadership?
So I think there's two ways that I could answer that question. One is, how do I be more influential with my team? And how do I be seen or be more influential sort of outside of my team in the larger organization? And we could talk about either one. So let's talk about each a little bit. Number one is, if we want to be more influential with our team, we have to recognize that we are already influencing our team. It's only a matter of if we're influencing them in the ways that we really would hope. So, in other words, our team is watching us, right? They are looking at us, at our behavior, and saying that must be what is expected. And so if we're not getting the kinds of outcomes with our team that we want, recognize that maybe we need to change our behavior first because our influence is, we are already, because of our position, having some amount of influence. Now, if we want to have greater influence, if there are really three factors that lead any of us to be influenced by others. One is a person's position, which you have as a leader. One is people's credibility or expertise. If people see you as knowing what you're talking about, then you're more influential. And then lastly, what's your relationship with them? Do people believe that you have their best interest at heart? Do they believe that you are trustworthy and all those things? So if I want to be more influential within my team, I need to think about those three things: my position, my expertise and credibility, and my relationships. Now, we take those same three things externally to the external or organization, and we still have the second, the last two, but the first one, our position, is different. And a lot of times we think, well, I'm only just a middle manager, I'm only just a first line supervisor, I'm only just a project manager, I'm only just an individual contributor, so how can I have influence? Well, we can, but we have to recognize that we can't rely on position to do it, which we sort of have that in our bail, in our bucket when we're the leader. So in short, that's another, Kate, big topic, but there's some things to help people get started.
Okay, that's nice. Also, I'd like to ask you, because you're the author of books, what does inspire you in writing your books, but also in your work? Where do you take your inspirations from?
Well, I'm fortunate because, as I said, I have a team, so I have the chance to, so I'm writing books, as we've talked about Remarkable Leadership, and we've talked a little bit about my brand new book that's coming out in a few months called The Long Distance Leader, which you can go on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and get a copy of now, pre-order. But I have the opportunity to lead a team every day, so I have the chance to see where are the challenges that I face, right? I have the opportunity to coach other leaders, so I have the chance to be inspired and have insights from them, both in terms of what's working and what's not. And then we spend a ton of time delivering workshops and speeches around the country and around the world. So I get the chance to interact. Point is, I get the chance to interact with lots and lots of leaders at different levels and organizations, which gives me a lot of examples and a lot of opportunities to identify where people are stuck, which gives us something to write about.
Okay, that sounds great. So one last question before we finish. The name of our podcast is How to Stay on Top of Your Work. How do you stay on top of your work? Do you have any maybe practices or something that you could recommend to our audience?
Yeah, so a couple of things that I think are helpful, and it's a great title for a podcast because it's a great goal for all of us, right? How do we stay on top of our work? And number one is I think we have to define our work clearly. And as leaders, too often we are in the work and not doing the work of leaders. And so one of the ways to stay on top of our work is to define our work clearly in terms of what is it that we should be doing, what's the best use of our time, how do we think about what we might delegate, about creating a not to-do list, the things we're not going to do at all that. So first, we're going to stay on top of our work. We got to know what our work is and what the right work is. And then, we need good strategies, and I could share a bunch of them with you, none of which will probably be new. But I think you ought to have a very clear focus on what I need to be learning so that makes the list. If we don't put on the list the important items, we'll spend all of our time on the urgent items. Like, for example, this morning at 10 till 8, I had a bunch of stuff I could be doing. Instead, I'm dialing in to have this conversation with Kate. Because this wasn't the most urgent thing on my calendar, but it's a super important thing, right? For me to have the chance to share with others, for Kate and I to build our relationship, and a bunch of other reasons. There's important stuff here, and so if we don't plug in the important, if we don't schedule the goal work, if you will, then it'll never happen because we'll be deluged by the activity, and we'll be deluged by the urgent. So if I were to give two pieces of advice, one is be very clear on what the work is so we can stay on top of it, and then schedule important stuff. Those are two pieces of advice.
Okay, that sounds nice. One more thing I'd like to ask you. What is the number one rule in your life, in your work, without which you can't imagine your day? Just one thing that you would choose from, all your things.
Well, I will stay in the line of what we were just talking about, and I'll say that one of the things that I use, I don't know if it's the one, maybe the one is brush your teeth, but the one that comes to mind when you ask the question is to always be asking yourself, what's the best use of my time right now? What's the best use of my time right now? And if I know the answer to that question most of the time. And if I am asking myself that, then I am far more productive, but I'm far more influential. I'm a far better leader, etc. So if I know what's important and then I ask myself that question regularly, then I have a much better chance of being successful.
Okay. Thank you. Kevin, it was my pleasure to talk to you. I hope I didn't interrupt your other duties. I really enjoyed our conversation.
No, not at all. In fact, the point is, this is exactly what I should have been doing this morning. And listen, it's been a pleasure to be with you. And, if people can find, as you talked about it, the book Remarkable Leadership, you can go to remarkableleadership.com and learn more about that, or you can go to your favorite bookseller for that. And the brand new book coming is The Long Distance Leader. And we'd love to have people take a look at that. You can pre-order it if you're listening to this in the spring. In June, the book will come out, and we'd love to have you there. And you can always go to my blog at kevineikenberry.com.
All right. So, dear listeners, you can find more information about Kevin Eikenberry under this podcast. Make sure to check it out and stay updated with the latest news from Kevin and his books. Don't forget to subscribe for more content and listen to other podcasts from Time Camp, and have a nice and productive day. See you around.
This podcast was brought to you by Time Camp. You can listen to it on iTunes and SoundCloud. Subscribe to get more content and always stay on top of your work.